Welcome to the business podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. AmCham business podcasts are hosted by Dr. Duff Watkins. Duff is a director of Exec Search International, an author, and is also on the AmCham Council of Governors. AmCham, bringing business to you.
Hello and welcome. Today we address the topic of risky business. Can you really future-proof your organization? That is, can you really reduce risk in your organization? My name is Duff Watkins. I'm your host today on the AmCham Business Podcast. And today our guest is Kevin Bates, Global Head of Risk and Insurance for Lend Lease. Lend Lease is an international leading company in property and infrastructure, and they've operated for over 50 years across the globe from Australia to Asia, Europe, and the Americas. They employ 17,000 people around the world, and they have an extensive portfolio of assets. And with those assets comes risk. Now, Kevin, my first question for you is, what does risk mean to you? Now, I want to jump in here and say, I know that the views that you're expressing are your views only, are not officially those of Lend Lease, but you've got experience in this area as Global Head of Risk, so that's why you're here. We'd like to hear more from you. What does risk mean to you?
Sure. Thanks very much, Duff, and thanks for inviting me along. I think 2014 has been a very interesting year in the risk space from my perspective, and I've spent almost 15 years, I guess, in this space, and I think the developments that you see certainly over the last even 12 to 18 months has been quite phenomenal. And you've seen far more sophisticated methodology adopted by organizations in terms of how they analyze risk, and the data analytics that go into it now are significantly more advanced than have been in the past. But when you look at that landscape, and you look and you say, what are the top 10 risks, for example, they're probably no different to that which they were last year, year before. Mm-hmm. They're just in a different order. Now, that's symptomatic of the political environment, the economic environment, etc., as to the order that they're in. We haven't really had a black swan event like a GFC, or I guess the last time there was a new entrant in that top 10, it was probably around the Y2K bug, when everyone got very excited about that, or cyber risk, everyone gets excited about that.
Well, what are some of the mundane, average, typical risks that companies like yours, or any company who runs?
Sure. The way to look at it, I guess, Duff, is you can probably split them up pretty easily into three dimensions. You can look at macroeconomic risks, you can look at strategic risks, and you can look at operational risks. Now, by macroeconomic risks, we're talking about volatility in the capital markets, for example. Mm-hmm. We're talking about political stability and the impact that has on your business. We're talking about regulatory regimes. When they change, what impact does that have on you, and how are you dealing with that? And of course, in the macroeconomic space, you've obviously got access to capital. That's a big issue that everyone faces. When you look at the strategic component, by that I mean, of course, can we actually execute our strategy? The one that it jumps out to me there is the disruptive technology space, and that is what has changed that you were unable to predict, that now means that either you've got to react or you've got to change your operating model to be able to react. Now, a really trite example, and it's an internally focused example, is the iPhone. Mm-hmm. Now, when you think about when that came out, no one saw it coming. It came out, and internally within organizations, everyone wanted one. And yet your IT team told you couldn't have one because security-wise, it was not as secure as a BlackBerry, for example. You then had some very senior members of your team telling you that they were having one, and they would find ways to backdoor how do you get your emails, etc. And again, I'm talking certainly not about my organization, I'm talking holistically here, to the point where ICT teams had to come up with a solution around the security model, and it very much turned on its head its operating platform. So that's what I talk about there in terms of that disruptive technology. In the operational space, you can be talking again about a whole host of things, but I guess the key one that jumps out to me there is how are we operating, and therefore our supply chain, the viability of that supply chain. The way the economy is looking right now, you're seeing a number of suppliers and contractors who are doing it tough, and unless you're cognizant of that risk, you will be in a bit of trouble. So those, I guess, are the standard ones. But I mean, you've mentioned we're here to talk about future-proofing and can you future-proof an organization, and that's the key area that we'd certainly like to go to. So notwithstanding, those are the standard risks, if you like. That's your top 10, what you'd look to. If you're fortunate enough to have a C-suite who are generous with their time and they'll share with you what keeps them awake at night, sure, they'll talk about the economic drivers, they'll be worried about market stagnation, they'll be worried about competitive pressures, notably overseas competitors coming into play in our space. They'll be acutely aware of reputational damage and impact. But if you really listen, they will tell you that they're looking to leave a legacy. And in order to do that, the question they'll ask you is, how can I future-proof my organization? And I guess that's where we take this today, Duff. So,
well, it's as you say, risk. You were identifying things that you simply cannot predict, which is one way of saying that is stuff happens. You know, you simply can't see it coming. So therefore, and stuff happens a lot, and increasingly, if I'm hearing you correctly, Kevin, stuff happens very, very fast too, as well.
It can, absolutely right. But then you also have the slow burn effect of things, that things are just consistently evolving and occurring and happening, and a business environment doesn't need to change overnight. It doesn't need to be a natural disaster, for example. It doesn't need to be a GFC. It can just be the natural evolution of business. And bear in mind, of course, Duff, risk is all about the unpredictability of an outcome based on certain events. That can be positive and negative, and people forget that. People look at it as risk is bad, opportunity is good. It's not. It's about the predictability of an outcome. It can be both good and bad. That's just risk management. Depends on how good you are at it. But I guess when you look at then this question and issue of future-proofing, and what is that, and what does it mean? It can mean very different things to very different people. So I guess for our benefit here, it's sensible of me to break it down into the sort of key tenets of what I consider to be key to future-proofing. And one of those is people, another is technology, and another is the business interruption component. So should we go into that?
Yes, please do. Yeah, business interruption. When you well, I have an idea of what you mean by that. Are we talking about earthquakes, tsunamis, nuclear events in Japan? I remember the meltdown that occurred in
11th of March 2011.
Yeah, okay. So a risk guy would know that. Yes.
Well, at the time I was actually up in Asia, so that was part of the region I was looking after. It's interesting that you mentioned that you've had that, you've had the Cyclone Yazi events, you've had the floods across in the UK. So that tells you, in terms of when you focus on the business interruption component, it means we're not just talking about do I have a crisis management plan in place. It means, have I thought it through and have I tested it? And to give you some sort of anecdotal evidence in this space, insurers have paid out over the last 3 years, year on year, in excess of $70 billion for what has been classified as extreme weather events. Now, to give that a benchmark, throughout the end of the 90s and early 2000s, you were talking about a number of circa 15 billion flatline. So it's increased exponentially. So you then have to look at your crisis management plan and say, has mine been enhanced? Do I know what to do? What happens when a natural disaster occurs? What happens when a fire occurs? What happens when a rain event occurs? Now, the UK is a tremendous example of that. You've got to look at your systems, not just can I be up and back and operational. You've also then got to look at what are the key components of my system to allow me to do business. Is it accounts payable, accounts receivable? Is it payroll? What about the IT space and technology there? Do I have backups for everything? How often is it backed up? You then look at your reputation and your brand impact. Now, a very intelligent head of corporate affairs once told me that back in the day you used to have approximately 6 hours to deal with a crisis event, just because of the way the media cycles ran. Now with Twitter and Facebook and the like, you've got about 6 minutes. So
that much?
As much as that, yeah. On a good day.
Yeah.
So has that been tried and tested? Do the corporate affairs teams know what to do and how to do it? Or will the first time they do it be when there is a real event? Because you never want that to be the case. So you have to look at all these kind of things.
So do you actually model these disasters in order to give them some experience before it actually occurs?
Oh, you have to, absolutely. The ways in which you get this experience are twofold. The first is, of course, the unfortunate event happens, so you have a real scenario, and that's where you get some battle scars, you work out the resilience of your plan, and so on and so forth. But if you're fortunate enough not to have any of these events, you do need to do simulations. You need to test your plan. You need to test your people. Seldom does a crisis occur at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the totality of your crisis management team have a 3-hour window blocked out in their diary when they have nothing else going on. They tend to happen at night when key members of your crisis management team are on a plane somewhere, or they're overseas, they're uncontactable, they're out for dinner, they're playing footy with their son. That's when crises happen. So you have to model it accordingly, and you have to do these simulations. But from a future, and that's great from your own whole of life organization perspective, but from a future-proofing perspective, the Japan tsunami and earthquake and nuclear event is a great example that you mentioned, Duff, because companies I know were up and running pretty quickly after that. But there was no one to do business with. And that's because it was not a key component of a strategic procurement platform to check that your suppliers and your subcontractors had an adequate business interruption model and crisis management plan in place. So you can be as good as you like, but you might have no one to do business with because they're not up and running. And then you take into that political uncertainty in supply chain. There was suggestion at one point by the Japanese government that they were going to suspend export of steel because they might need it for rebuilding efforts. Now, there could be projects globally that were reliant upon Japanese steel. What does Plan B look like? So, and you're then talking, of course, delays in terms of projects. You're talking about partially finished. So how do you then warrant what's gone before in terms of the material and, of course, the installation of material? So you have to look at all this in terms of a whole-of-life business interruption when you're looking at future-proofing.
That actually sort of reminds me of well, not really a joke, but a funny anecdote. The joke used to be that McDonald's, the restaurant, the hardest thing in the world was to become a supplier to McDonald's because they have such high standards and they enforce those high standards on you as a supplier. The second hardest thing in the world is to cease being a supplier to McDonald's because they simply cannot afford for you to fail once they get you up to that high level. So they're continually making sure that you're matching the high standards in order to do business with them. Now that leads me to ask, where do you draw the line? How do you ensure that your suppliers, your vendors, your business partners are, that they too are coping adequately with risk?
Well, and I guess the question is, can you? How do you and can you? Because it goes back to you look at a strategic procurement model, and I dare say most companies globally have a form of pre-qualification that they will look to. And I don't think it really matters what industry you're in. It just, thresholds will probably change depending on your industry. You will look at financial stability. You will look to see the last X years worth of accounts. You will do Dun and Bradstreet searches and all this sort of stuff to show financial stability. You will then look to previous project performance and say, well, what do you do in this space? You will definitely look at health and safety performance to find out whether or not they can comply with your ethos and ethics in that space. But then when it comes to crisis management and business interruption, I don't think organizations go to that depth. When you look at whole of risk, I don't think they go to that depth either, Duff. So I think from a future-proofing perspective, that's something that intelligent companies really ought to be building into their strategic procurement models, is what does their risk management profile look like? What does their business continuity plan look like? Crisis management plan look like? Is it aligned with ours? And you can use it as a point of difference. You can use it as exactly as you've suggested with the McDonald's scenario, you can take them on a journey. Everyone wins out of that. No one loses. And even your competitors win out of it, because it means the economy remains strong and it remains buoyant because you've got a number of players who are resilient in that market. So it's an interesting area. In terms of other aspects of future-proofing, so that's an external focused one. Think about the internal focused one, and I look to people. So in the people space, Duff, I think you'll have seen this as well, I'm certain of it. There are maybe 3 or 4 key areas that make you sort of gasp in terms of how things have changed over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And those include things such as a shrinking talent pool right now. And the impacts that will have on a business, of course, are that there's such competition, fierce competition for the really high caliber individuals. And of course that comes at a capital cost as well. People know their value, they know their worth, and they're happy to put their hand out and ask for it. So that's one area that you look internally and you think, geez, we've got to future-proof our people side of life. And you then take it a stage further and you say, well, what does the demographic of our employee base look like? And you realize that you've got a very multi-generational workforce right now. And that's symptomatic of a number of things. One of which I've seen certainly is when the GFC hit, you had a number of the baby boomer generation who were ready to retire, but then couldn't, because the retirement benefits and retirement funds that they had were blown to pieces. So they stuck around, and that was great. You know, companies did very well out of that because they retained the intellectual property. What you now have is Gen X and Gen Y who don't have what the baby boomer generation are carrying around in their head. And from a resilience perspective and a future-proofing perspective, has anyone actually sat down and said, in almost a succession planning way, you need to sit down with this person twice a week for 3 hours each time, every single week until your retirement, to make sure everything that's going on in your head is passed across. I don't think that happens. That happens either. And if you contextualize that again anecdotally, there are statistics around the sort of mark of circa 50 to 60% in the oil and gas space. 50 to 60% of the current employees will be retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. That's a staggering statistic. And when you think of the IP that goes with that, if companies really aren't on top of this future-proofing and this succession planning, they will lose out significantly.
Okay, well, let me ask you this, Sanki. I'm sitting here, I'm a baby boomer guy, and you're sitting there at Gen Y without a single gray hair in your head in this international role. And so there could be this transfer of knowledge from my generations, I'll be representing the baby boomers, to you, the younger guys. But is it very much knowledge to be transferred? Because the nature of business has transformed so rapidly, so quickly. A lot of what I know, which is pretty valuable to me, at least I think so, may not be so relevant to you and your generation, and not to mention the generation behind you.
Well, it is and it isn't. I think it is, and this is the Kevin Bates view on it all, and that is, you don't know if it's valuable or not until it's distilled across. And bear in mind, innovation is incremental improvements on things. It's not like invention, which is coming up with something from scratch. Now, when you impart all this information, I might, using the advances that my generation allegedly have in terms of technological advances and so on and so forth, I might be able to create innovations based on everything you've told me. I might not directly replicate that. I might be able to enhance it, but we'll never know unless we do it. And there will be a significant component that we say, you know what, systems have overtaken us now, but great to know. But there will definitely be components that we can grab and say, that's genius, we need to do this. Because we've all seen it time and time and time again, and it's notably when the chips are down, you do have the baby boomer who says, I've got this, guys. And he will go back to something he has remembered from years gone by that is tried and tested and it works, but we're losing that, and we are. And I guess that takes us to, of course, the working values, which is another of the areas in terms of the people future-proofing that concerns me. that is that the values of our workforce are changing. It is multi-generational, but the values are changing. If you look at the Gen X and the Gen Y, seldom do you hear of straight out of college, enter an organization, and they will retire at that organization in the same way that has been the case for the baby boomer generation. It's much more mercenary in terms of how it's done. They're aware of the shrinking talent pool. They're aware of the wealth that they can attract. They're aware of the fact that they can jump from organization to organization, and every single time they go around, they will get a step up in their salary. They're also aware that lifestyle is very important to them. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they will jump around and they will earn what they earn, and then they will say, I'm out for the next 12 months. Thanks very much indeed. So from a continuity perspective, we're seeing a huge change in the guard in terms of how the fluidity of a workforce operates. And I guess I certainly don't have the answers, but what I do have is that unless organizations are putting this very much on their plate as this is a future-proofing issue that we have to address, that they really will be missing a trick.
Okay, but just to wrap up, then what would be our takeaways today, Kevin? What would you like our listeners to know, to take away, to understand about risk?
I guess key takeaways. One is around technology, and if you look at technologies, it's not saying that technology needs to be core to your business. However, it is saying that you need to embrace technology as a core component for a sustainable business. And that'll be looking to leverage off of not only what's out there, but also looking to marrying up with the MITs, the INSEADs, the Harvards of this world to create your think tanks and look at what does the future look like in my space, because it will undoubtedly involve technology. But I guess the overarching thing to take away is that you've got revenues, you've got profits, you've got market position, you've got reputation, and you've got share price. And if you look at those as the real pillars of corporate resilience, and taking away any one of those could have a significant impact on an organization or its management team. You risk all of that if you don't take future-proofing seriously and manage it in exactly the same way that you do day-to-day risks or business-as-usual risks.
So could we say that although we're not sure if future-proofing is possible, it's still worth attempting?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, Duff.
Okay, we'll finish here today. You've been listening to the AmCham Business Podcast. Today, our guest has been Kevin Bates, Global Head of Risk and Insurance for Lend Lease Organization. My name's Duff Watkins, and thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to the Business Podcast of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. This podcast is supported by Lenovo and VML. Lenovo is one of the world's leading personal technology companies, producing innovative PCs and mobile internet devices. Lenovo, for those who do. VML is a full-service digital marketing agency that can take you where you want to go. Everything we are is in everything we do. This is AmCham.